As a genre, fantasy is in a very interesting place at the moment. It's enormous on streaming services, while literary fantasy is rife with fascinating work from diverse creators. Mitchell and I took that as the theme of this conversation, which was originally meant to be a quick 2-minute intermission in our most recent episode. Welcome to Pop Politics. We didn't get to it last time, but you mentioned that you were reading a fantastic looking graphic novel. What was
Aha!
that?
Coda. I've gotten up to volume 2.
Mm-hmm.
Sai Spurrier and Matthias Bergara. I hope I've pronounced those names correctly. Um, it's a really good looking book. I started it because I read any fantasy comics I can find. I think that if you enjoy colorful comic artwork, there may not be a more interesting comic that I can think of in the past 3 years. So definitely worth a look. I think Coda's worth looking at just for the great art. The interesting part of it that was why I wanted to talk about it is because you're also into fantasy literature.
Yeah.
It's interesting that fantasy comics, you would think, with the huge crossover in audience, that fantasy comics would be anywhere near where fantasy prose is, and it absolutely isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because fantasy literature right now is in a really cool place with self-publication and own voices and all kinds of things from all parts of the world. I'd say like we're still on the upswing of this new fantasy literature boom, and it's incredibly exciting. Whereas fantasy comics have sort of swung back and forth several times in the 21st century, and right now, if only from the couple of different series I've been reading lately, they seem to be recapitulating the problems of fantasy in the 80s and 90s, which is just about every one of these comics is this ain't your daddy's Middle Earth.
Yep.
This is the version of the fantasy universe where it's bloody and they swear.
The whole
Which is
grimdark nonsense.
Grimdark, yeah. It's funny actually that we bring it up on the same episode where we're talking about a comic book that has an instance of nudity and swearing, because I don't care if those happen to be in the comic, but there is a certain attitude towards excess and faux maturity that comes with Grimdark that sometimes can get in the way of a good story. And you'll find that a lot of comics are riding that line right now in the fantasy space. They're so obsessed with presenting an image of a comic book that isn't your daddy's fantasy, that is like, oh, in this one the orcs are sexy and the elves swear, is something that I've seen like 3 times from different writers. It's so funny and weird, but I thought it was worth bringing up as part of the general conversation. And yeah, I'd like to recommend Coda if you give it a shot. It's not the most original because it's part of this wave, but it's certainly the most pretty.
Yeah, I think with my reviews for Aureus, I review a lot of different things. And I've definitely noticed sort of 2 strands in fantasy literature. It could just be the books that I pick to review, but one strand is like we're seeing a lot of, I guess, non-Western fantasy literature coming out at the moment, and that's the kind of thing I really, really love because it gives you it gives us perspectives into like different mythologies and different ways of thinking and seeing about the world, and I really enjoy that. And the other thing is subversion, and like subversion of old school tropes, and it's something that we're keenly aware of. People are actively writing back against J.R.R. Tolkien's whole sort of a mythology that he created.
Yeah, perhaps not realizing that the very thing they want to do with this has been done about every 20 years since Tolkien made Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Um, but I do still think there are some interesting things coming out, and it sounds kind of like Coda and what you're talking about doesn't necessarily sound like subversion, but it does sound like sort of trying to do something new with those tropes, but then
Hmm.
falling into their own sort of tropey sphere of trying to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason I'm glad I got to book two is because book one starts with I hate saying this, but standard fantasy world, as in it's got elves and wizards. It's trying to be like, what if that fantasy world became Mad Max, and then the narrative of the first couple of issues is more or less just Mad Max.
Huh.
So unlike so many of these fantastic books that are coming from non-Western perspectives and uh, own voices inside of our own countries, like people writing from different perspectives that haven't seen the the limelight, you might say. Unlike that, it starts out in a way that if you've seen more than 50 movies in your lifetime and you've read more than 10 fantasy books, you're automatically going to put the pieces together. It's so there's an argument you could make about it being satirical. So, it's important that there are bits you recognize so that when it twists them, you can go, "Oh, that's interesting. It's a clever idea that he did that." Uh, but I'd say most readers are going to get it from a lot less than what a book like this does. And so many comics do this, where you just spell elf differently, you
Mm.
know, and people are like, "Oh, it's elves. I get it because it's a fantasy world like Tolkien." Um, I I don't necessarily respect a lot of stories that do that, so I have to push through that opening most of the time. I have to be like, "All right, cross my fingers and hope that this develops into something more original and interesting," because I understand that so many of these American comics will start with the most generic vibes you can possibly have.
Mm.
I guess, like you say, it's about drawing people in, but um, it's odd, isn't it? When you with Aurealis have got to be reading books that just like they do anything but elves, but spelled differently.
Mm. Yeah. Like one of the big ones that I always remember is one called David Mogo Godhunter. And it's by a Nigerian writer called I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Suyi Devi Okunbowa. Um, and so yeah, it's about this guy who's I'm fairly I read it a while ago, but I'm fairly certain he's a demigod, and he's basically going around and capturing because the sort of other world of Nigerian folklore has collapsed into the real world. So he's going around Lagos and trying to fix things to some degree and like tamp down what the gods are doing. And it's just a really fun ride. That there's no elves, there's no dwarves. It's this incredibly different sort of folklore that people like you and I probably haven't really come across very often.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm not going to complain if something's based in a milieu that we understand. Like as you say, we haven't come across a much Nigerian folklore as white Australians, but even if it's based in a folklore or a mythology that I really understood, something like God of War is in the Greek pantheon of the original games or in the Norse of the recent games, you know, there are ways of doing it that you don't instantly groan. I,
mm,
I would suggest that the new God of War is exactly that. Like, the new God of War is almost a counterexample of the kind of American writing that I'm talking about in fantasy comics, because it's almost in some ways like a sequel to Norse myth,
Mm.
because you know from the start why that it's odd that a Greek guy has now taken place of one of these Norse mythological figures, and everything that happens in that game. I'm not going to spoil anything because I imagine you're still halfway through.
No, I'm done. I finished it.
Oh, you are done.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So we can talk about the fact that like there's a great big hole in that game that Loki should fit into,
Mm.
and you're spending the entire game
Being like,
seeing everything that's going on in the Norse mythology that you recall from learning Norse mythology, and then you get to the end, and the reveal is like, oh my goodness, that's crazy. Uh,
mm,
it's the opposite of starting with something familiar because you want to draw people in and then twisting it a little bit to make it edgy.
yeah.
Instead, it's like, no, you would assume this is familiar because it's showing you the giants and dwarves and all of the little things that make it feel like our sort of cultural understanding of Norse mythology. But the bits it doesn't do make you ask questions. And that's this sort of fizzling undercurrent of interest. You're like, oh, it's not telling me who this or why that. So, and by the end, when it's revealed, it's exciting. Um, I
I think,
wish I wish movies and comics could do that more often. And it sounds like with the fantasy literature boom right now, we're getting lots of books that are more interested in that than
yeah.
in just drawing you in with elves and wizards.
Yeah. One final comment is I just wanted to mention about God of War. The one thing that I really liked was that we don't see Thor and Odin in that entire game. We hear so much about them, and I think it creates this really powerful mythology around them within the game. And I just find that so exciting because it's sort of focused on the parts of the story that you don't normally hear about
Mm.
as much. So yeah, I'm now very much looking forward to Ragnarok and killing
Yeah,
Thor because he sounds like a douche.
it's so much more fun than the current fandom discussion going on around something like Star Wars, where the the Star Wars canon is what Disney bought more or less. So
Mm,
all of the stuff that's gone on in the existing movies and TV shows is now fodder for them to sell more Star Wars to people. And the glup shito of it all is, oh, hey, I recognize that person. Um, every new episode is, hey, it's glup shito, everyone, he's back. Uh, that's sort of a manufactured example of this God of War thing, where
mm,
in God of War, instead, it feels organic because it comes from elsewhere. It's not just God of War stuff. It's this vague collection of stories that have filtered down through hundreds of years. And so when there is someone like Thor or Odin who we haven't seen yet, and we're like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next. I mean, you know, looking at parts of the second half of that game and what they depict about certain characters doing certain things at Ragnarok, and knowing that there's a very big timey-wimey thing going on
mm,
that we won't understand until the next game comes out is very exciting. Because it's not just within the context of a game, it's broader than that, where you
yeah,
and I are looking at it going, this is exciting because it's all the creative possibilities they can sort of draw on. They're not limited by a brand.